Oh, invisible human.
Hey, hey.
Hey.
Right. I thought I'd put my hood up as well, and we can be hood brothers. How are you doing?
All right.
Yeah?
All right.
I have 4 layers on today, I think.
I have 4 layers on pretty much every day.
Yeah.
Is it cold in your house then? Have you not got your heating on?
I have not got my heating on. I'm trying as long as I can without putting it on. I'll crack soon enough. I'm trying to make it to at least November before I have to put the heating on.
Yeah, when I can see my breath in every room, I
That's
put the
probably a
heating
good
on.
sign.
And that happened at the beginning of October.
Wow, okay.
We had a bunch of hard frost that killed everything in the garden, and then suddenly went away again. We don't even get nice frosty mornings. We just get dead garden plus rain.
Yeah. Boo. Yes.
Hey, Duncan.
No.
You're looking very sci-fi today.
I don't want to be on planet Earth at the moment.
This is probably not good for your health.
Well, being on planet Earth, probably not, no.
I mean, neither, to be honest. There don't seem to be very many good places to live that aren't Earth that we know about yet.
We're not going to fix that by sitting here complaining about the other places, though, are we?
Aren't we?
Probably not, no. I mean, genuinely, if there was a one-way, a reasonable-looking one-way colony trip to the Mars, I would absolutely take it.
That would be a hard life.
Yeah, but probably worth it for, you know, humanity as a whole.
Yeah.
I just spent an hour listening to a podcast about American politics.
Oh, no.
God, why would you do that to yourself?
No wonder you don't want to look
legalities around presidential elections rather than, you know, the general state.
I mean,
utterly
neither's good.
fascinating, but thoroughly depressing.
Yes, 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 yes. I concur completely.
Katie, have you got any good spooky poetry time for Saturday?
I have, but I might not be there.
Are you on holiday?
I am on holiday.
Yay!
So
This
I
is the
may
holiday
or
you
may
keep
not be
telling me
shooting
about.
into holiday on holiday. I may not be story timing on holiday.
That makes sense, yeah.
We also might. We'll see. We'll see how we're feeling.
Depends how bored we get of each other.
Oh.
Story time it is then, Ayla.
Oh. So what place have you booked? Is it a nice little cottage or Airbnb or? Yeah. Oh, that's really super sweet.
Today we made a shopping list.
Ah, what's on the list?
Lots of things.
Ooh.
You'd think that we don't have any food already. I guess when you're planning to be, you know, a week somewhere without going to the shops, you need to.
Week's a long time.
Yeah, you do eat a lot of food in a week.
Yeah.
Especially if you're on holiday and like eating treaty food.
Yes. Yeah. So are you going to make lots of cakes and things and take them with you? Do you think?
I did that this morning while watching Frozen 2. And then I went to work.
Good? Should I watch Frozen 2? Is that any good?
Did you like Frozen 1?
I did.
Then you should watch Frozen 2.
Oh, okay, great. I will do.
I came at the perfect time. I love Frozen 2. Watch Frozen 2. I will watch party it with you. I love it.
Oh,
is it as much of an earworm as the first one?
No.
Good.
However, it does have dancing moose.
Sorry?
It does have dancing moose.
I have no problem with dancing moose. It's songs that get stuck in my head that I have problems with.
Oh, you might have some problems there.
No, I don't think it's as catchy.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
No, but it calls back to the original ones in ways that get the old ones stuck in my head.
Why can't they just let it go?
You're awful and I hate you.
Oh, that's cute.
I am awful, but you don't hate me.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Oh.
I haven't had a very good day.
Oh no. Do you want to talk about it or talk about other things?
Just work was insanely busy with like loads and loads and loads of urgent deadlines.
Oh.
And then instead of doing my nice yoga, which I was looking forward to, me and Nick had a disagreement about COVID restrictions and seeing his family.
Oh dear. Oh.
Which needed to happen, but wasn't fun.
Oh.
But then we watched Buffy and ate soup.
Watched Buffy and ate soup, did you say? Oh.
What kind of soup?
Like a coconutty soup with rice and mushrooms in.
Thai style soup. Excuse me.
Hey, Bina.
Hey.
Hey Frankie, hey Bina.
Hi, sweeties. How y'all doing?
Good, but very cold. Is the
Oh, honey, I was going to
consensus, I
say
think.
you're all bundled up like a little bug in a rug.
You know what you need, Mike? You
I need
need
a person. I need a human to cuddle.
yeah, you need a sofa full of story timers to like lie on you.
Yes, please.
Me.
Oh, that reminds me so much
You
of
have a story timer to lie on you, Frankie.
Oh. Do you remember when I'm not sure they're allowed to do this, but when we were in Newcastle, no, not Newcastle, it was Hood, Blues in the Hood, and we all sat on the sofa together and like all, yeah. Is that what you were talking about, Katie?
More or less.
Yeah.
Oh, Frankie, we thought of another inducement to come and stay with us.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We're not too keen on our spare bed and we'd like an excuse to get rid of it. So do you want to come and break it for us?
Yes. Yes, I would like. I would like that. I mean, should I bring Martin, or are you volunteering?
I mean, bring as many people as you like.
Do you want to come and help me break Katie's spare bed? That's a thumbs up. How exciting! Yeah, well, I mean, anything for a friend, you know, like.
Thank you, Frankie. I know it's a real sacrifice for you.
You know, I'll jump on that grenade for you because I love you.
Is grenade a euphemism or?
Yeah, it is. something go off in my face.
Hey,
Oh,
Also, hi, sweetie. Well, let me flick through and see who is here. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Hey, Vina. Hey, Evan. Hi, Rory.
I love that.
Rory's playing Storytime the game at the moment.
You're glowing. You have a glowing item. That's very exciting. Oh.
Xbox controllers, huh?
He's given up. We've lost it.
He doesn't love us anymore.
Hey, hello, Tara. Doesn't love us anymore. Rory, why don't you love us anymore?
I super do. I was shutting down the PlayStation where I was just watching the first part, and boy howdy, sounds like our Golem dodged a bullet with this dude.
Where in here? Then where? We'll go outside somewhere. And if someone sees us and asks us what we're doing.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, darling. Thank you.
I mean, he did seem to have like actual feelings for her. Like, it might not have gone absolutely terribly.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you're going to be the kind of guy who is so, like, arrogant and creepy that you have to have a wife made for you out of clay, like, he could have treated her worse.
It was clearly a cherished possession of his.
Yeah.
And that's really all anyone can hope for from a relationship, right?
Exactly. That's what marriage is like, right?
Frankie, how could you not tell me that In a Prudential Light wasn't finished?
How could I not tell you what, my darling?
The fanfic that you recommended, where Lizzie marries Mr. Collins, is only half finished.
I didn't recommend that one. I believe that was Kitty's recommend.
If you're going to read it, it's really good, but it's not finished.
I cannot with works in progress. That's because I get too all up in and about it, and then I get too frustrated. So I will probably, if it is unfinished, I will probably never read it.
That reminds me, did Kitty tell you folks about Sanditon?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was like a series, I guess like a soap opera really, that is adapted from Jane Austen's last unfinished manuscript. But like, which I totally get, taking the premise and then running with it because it's inherently open-ended. But it is by turns both like incredibly chaste, where a governess is scandalized by this her ward like bearing her ankles while paddling in the shallows because gentlemen might see, and then like pivots hard into like incest in the next scene. Like, all right, well, yeah.
Wow.
It's engrossing. So
Trust me to land at the awkward part of the conversation.
I was gonna say, hey Andrea.
Hi.
Who else have you got? Hi Jonathan. Hi Pontiff and Mike. Lisa and Jonas. Hello beautifuls. Or possibly just hello Lisa. It's Jonas. Lisa.
Oh, Lisa's
hello,
awake!
Lisa.
Yay!
but yeah.
Lisa, your hair just gets more and more glorious. Right?
Right.
I'm reading this book where one of the main characters keeps getting described when she uses magic as having a golden halo, and I honestly, like, if I could visualize a golden halo, my brain doesn't, it would be like Lisa's hair in the wind.
Yeah. Hard agree. How is everybody doing today? What is a cool thing that somebody has done today?
I hoovered the whole house.
Yeah. Okay,
I
well,
still
I'd rather
think to be a cool.
I went for a scaly walk.
Oh, that's
And I woke
lovely.
up to, it's full on winter wonderland here this morning, like grassy trees looking beautiful. I thought it was getting bad yesterday, but oh, Katie, do you have a question?
Storytime.
What's that?
Storytime, Frankie.
Is it story time? Yeah. Okay. Should I tell the others? Yeah. Okay. Listen up, everybody. Ding, 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 ding. I believe it's story time.
Could we say hello to the catch-up crew before we start this one? We always say goodbye, but we don't usually say hello.
That is such a fucking great shout. You're a genius, and I love you.
Thank you.
Catch-up crew. Hi, catch-up crew. Hi, catch-up crew. We love you. And actually, special definite shout out potentially to Cara, who may or may not at some point catch up with these. Probably isn't going to be able to join us for them live, but I don't know if she was planning on watching and catch up. So Cara, we miss you and we love you very much. And here is a big hug for you. Now. Let's everybody settle down. Simmer down, you noisy lot. Now, are you sitting comfortably? So fucking cute, I might die. Then I'll begin. Barefoot, clad only in an old work shirt of Arbeely's and a pair of dungarees, the Djinni stood at the railing at Castle Gardens at the southern tip of Manhattan and stared out across the bay. Arbeely stood nearby, perhaps afraid to draw too close. The shirt and dungarees had come from a pile of old rags in the corner of Arbeely's workshop. The dungarees were solder stained and there were holes burned into the shirt sleeves. Arbelia had to show him how to do up the buttons. The Djinni leaned against the railing, transfixed by the view. He was a creature of the desert, and never in his life had he come so close to this much water. It lapped at the stone below his feet, reaching now higher, now lower. Muted colours floated on its surface, the afternoon sunlight reflecting in the ever-changing dips of the waves. Still, it was hard to believe that this was not some expert illusion intended to befuddle him. At any moment, he expected the city and water to dissolve, to be replaced by the familiar steppes and plateaus of the Syrian desert, his home for close to 200 years. And yet the moments ticked away, and New York Harbour remained stubbornly intact. How, he wondered, had he come to this place? The Syrian desert is neither the harshest nor the most barren of the Arabian deserts, but it is nevertheless a forbidding place for those who do not know its secrets. It was here that the Djinni was born in what men would later call the 7th century. Of the many types of Djinn, they are a highly diverse race with many different forms and abilities. He was one of the most powerful and intelligent. His true form was insubstantial as a wisp of air and invisible to the human eye. When in this form, he could summon winds and ride them across the desert. But he could also take on the shape of any animal and become as solid as if he were made of muscle and bone. He would see with that animal's eyes, feel with that animal's skin. But his true nature was always that of the Djinn, who were creatures of fire, in the same manner that humans are said to be creatures of earth. And like all his brethren Djinn, from the loathsome flesh-eating ghouls to the tricksterish ifrits, he never stayed in one shape for very long. The Djinn tend to be solitary creatures, and this one was more so than most. In his younger years, he participated in the haphazard rituals and airborne skirmishes of what could loosely be called Djinn society. Some minor slight or squabble would be seized upon, and hundreds of Djinn would summon the winds and ride them into battle, clan against clan. The gigantic whirlwinds they caused would fill the air with sand, and the other denizens of the desert would take shelter in caves and the shadows of boulders, waiting for the storm to pass. But as he matured, the Djinni grew dissatisfied with these diversions and took to wandering the desert alone. He was inquisitive by nature, though no one thing could hold his attention for long, and rode the winds as far as the west as the Libyan desert and east to the plains of Isfahan. In doing so, he took more of a risk than was sensible. Even in the driest desert, a rainstorm could strike with little warning, and a Djinni caught in the rain was in mortal danger. For no matter what shape a Djinni might assume, be it human or animal or its own true shape of no shape at all, it was still a living spark of fire and could easily be extinguished. But whether luck or skill guided his path, the Djinni was never caught out and roamed wherever he would. He used these trips as opportunities to search for veins of silver and gold, for the Djinn are natural metalsmiths, and this one was unusually adept. He could work the metals into strands no thicker than a hair, or into sheets or twisted ropes. The only metal he could not touch was iron, for, like all his kind, he held a powerful dread of iron and shied away from rocks veined with ore in the way a man might recoil from a poisonous snake. One can wander far and wide in the desert without spying another creature of intelligence. But the Djinn were far from alone, for they had dwelt as neighbours with humans for many hundreds of years. There were the Bedouin, the roving tribes of herdsmen who scratched out their perilous existence on what the desert had to offer. And there were also the human cities far to the east and west, which grew larger every year and sent their caravans through the desert between them. But neighbours though they were, both humans and Djinn harboured a deep distrust of each other. Humankind's fear was perhaps more acute, for the Djinn had the advantage of invisibility or disguise. Certain wells and caves and rock-strewn passes were considered habitations of the Djinn, and to trespass was to invite calamity. Bedouin women pinned amulets of iron beads to their babies' clothing to repel any Djinn that might try to possess them or carry them away and turn them to changelings. It was said among the human storytellers that there had once been wizards, men of great and dangerous knowledge who'd learned to command and control the Djinn and trap them in lamps or flasks. These wizards, the storytellers said, had long since passed from existence, and only the faintest shadows of their powers remained. But the lives of the Djinn were very long. A Djinni's lifespan might last 8 or 9 times the length of a human's, and their memories of the wizards had not yet faded to legend. The elder Djinn warned against encounters with humans and called them conniving and perfidious. The wizards' lost knowledge, they said, might be found again. It was best to be cautious. And so interactions between the two races mostly were kept to the occasional encounter, usually provoked by the lesser Djinn, the ghouls and ifrits who could not keep themselves from mischief. When young, the Djinni had listened to the elders' warnings and taken heed. In his travels, he'd avoided the Bedouin and steered clear of the caravans that moved slowly across the landscape, bound for the markets of Syria and Jazeera, Iraq and Isfahan. But it was perhaps inevitable that one day he should spy upon the horizon a column of some 20 or 30 men, their camels loaded with precious goods, and think, why should he not investigate? The Djinn of old had been incautious and foolhardy in allowing themselves to be captured, but he was neither. No harm would come from merely observing. He approached the caravan slowly and fell in behind at a safe distance, matching their pace. The men wore long, loose robes of many layers, all dusty with travel, and covered their heads with checked cloth against the wind. Snatches of their conversations carried to the Djinni on the wind, the time to their next destination or the likelihood of bandits. He heard the weariness in their voices, saw the fatigue that hunched their backs. These were no wizards. If they'd had any powers, they would magic themselves across the desert and save themselves this endless plodding. After a few hours, the sun began to lower, and the caravan passed into an unfamiliar part of the desert. The Djinni remembered his caution and turned back towards safer ground. But this glimpse of humankind had only inflamed his curiosity. He began to watch for the caravans and followed them more and more often, though always at a distance. For if he drew too close, the animals would grow nervous and skittish, and even the men would feel him as a wind at their backs. At night, when they came to rest at an oasis or caravanserai, the Djinni would listen to them talk. Sometimes they spoke of the distances they had to travel, their pains and worries and woes. Other times they spoke of their childhoods and the fireside tales their mothers and aunts and grandmothers had told them. They exchanged well-worn stories, boasts of their own or of the warriors of ages past, kings and caliphs and viziers. They all knew the stories by heart, though they never told them the same way twice, and quibbled happily over the details. The Djinni was especially fascinated at any mention of the Jinn, as when the men told tales of Suleiman, the human ruler who 700 years before had yoked the Jinn to his rule, the first and last of the human kings to do so. The Djinni watched and listened and decided they were a fascinating paradox. What drove these short-lived creatures to be so oddly self-destructive, with their punishing journeys and brutal battles? And how, at barely 18 or 20 years of age, could they grow to be so intelligent and cunning? They spoke of amazing accomplishments in cities such as Asham and Al-Quds, Sprawling markets and new mosques, wondrous buildings such as the world had never seen. Djinn kind, who did not like to be enclosed, had never attempted anything to compare. At most, the homes of the Djinn were bare shelters against the rain. But the Djinni grew intrigued by the idea. And so he selected a spot in the valley, and when he was not chasing caravans, began to build himself a palace. He heated and shaped the desert sands into curving sheets of opaque blue-green glass, forming walls and staircases, floors and balconies. Around the walls he wove a filigree of silver and gold, so that the palace appeared to be netted inside a shining web. He spent months making and unmaking it according to his whim, and twice razed it to the ground in frustration. Even when whole and habitable, the palace was never truly finished. Some rooms sat open to the stars, their ceilings confiscated to serve as floors elsewhere. The web of filigree grew as he found veins of metal in the desert rocks, and then all but vanished when he ransacked it to gild an entire hall. Like himself, the palace was usually invisible to other beings, but the men of the desert would sometimes glimpse it from a distance, as the last rays of the evening sun struck it and set it ablaze. Then they would turn and spur their horses faster, and not until many miles had passed and they were safe within sight of their own cooking fires would they dare to look back again. The shadows were growing longer at Castle Gardens, yet still the Djinni could not tear his eyes from the harbour. Once, when quite young, he'd come across a small pool in an oasis. In the manner of youth everywhere determined to test their limits, he took on the shape of a jackal, waded into the pool up to his haunches, and stood there as long as he dared, the chill seeping up through his pores and into his limbs. Only when he thought his legs might collapse did he leap back out again. It was the closest he'd ever come to death, and that had only been a very small pool. It would take almost no effort to vault the railing, to fall or leap in. Only a moment or two of immersion, and he would be extinguished. Nauseated, he dragged his eyes away. Steamers and tugboats chugged by, leaving their spreading wakes behind. At the horizon, the fading light picked out an undulating line of land. On an island in the middle distance, there stood an enormous statue in the shape of a woman, made of what looked to be some greenish metal. The scale of the statue was boggling. How many rocks must have been melted? How much raw metal collected to create her? And how did she not break through the thin disk of land and fall into the sea? According to Arbeely, this bay was only the smallest part of an ocean whose vastness defied comprehension. Even in his native form, he could never have hoped to cross it. And now that native form was lost to him. He'd examined the iron cuff thoroughly, hoping to find some overlooked weakness, but there was none. Wide but thin, it fit close to his wrist and was hinged on one side. The setting sunlight gave a dull sheen to the clasp with its pin. He couldn't budge the pin, no matter how hard he pulled, and he knew without even trying that Arbeely's tools would be no match for it. He closed his eyes and attempted for the 100th time to change form, straining against the cuff's enchantment. But it was as though the ability had never existed. And even more astonishing, he had no recollection of how it had come to be on his wrist. Along with their longevity, the Djinn were blessed with prodigious, near-eidetic memories, and the Djinni was no exception. To him, a human's powers of recollection would seem only a dubious patchwork of images. But the days, weeks, longer, that preceded capture and the event itself were concealed from his mind by a thick haze. His last clear memory was of returning to his palace after tracking an especially large caravan with close to 100 men and 300 camels. He'd followed them eastward for 2 days, listening to their conversations, slowly getting to know them as individuals. One camel driver, a thin, older man, liked to sing quietly to himself. The songs told of brave Bedouin men on swift horses and the virtuous women who loved them. But the man's voice carried a sadness, even when the words did not. 2 guards had discussed a new mosque in the city of Asham called the Grand Mosque, apparently in an immense building of stunning beauty. Another young guard was soon to marry, and the others all took turns joking at his expense, telling him not to worry. They would hide outside his tent on his wedding night and whisper what to do. The young guard retorted by asking why he should trust their advice on women, and his tormentors responded with fantastic tales of their own sexual prowess that had the entire company howling with laughter. He'd followed them until at last on the horizon he'd spied a low band of green. It was the Ghouta, the oasis fed by the river that bordered Asham. Reluctantly, he'd slowed his pace and watched until the caravan became a thin wedge on the horizon, a spear point piercing the Ghouta. The green belt might appear benign, but even the Djinni was not so rash as to travel into it. He was a djinn of the desert, and in the Ghouta's lush fields he would be out of his element. There were stories of creatures there that didn't take kindly to wayward jinn and would trick them into the river, holding them under until they were extinguished. He decided to exercise caution for once and return home. The journey back had been long, and by the time he reached his palace, a strange loneliness had settled over him. Perhaps it had to do with the caravan. He'd grown used to their conversations, their songs and stories, but he had no part in them. He merely overheard. Perhaps it had been too long since he'd sought out his own kind. He decided he would leave off chasing caravans and go to the habitations of his clan and dwell among them for a time. Perhaps he'd even seek out female companionship, a Djinniya who might desire his attentions. He'd arrived at his palace at sunset, making plans to leave again in the morning. And there his memories ended. After that, only 2 images penetrated the haze. In the first, a man's browned, gnarled hands clamped the iron cuff across his wrist, and with this image came the impression of searing cold and bottomless fear, a djinn's natural reaction to iron. But how, he wondered, did he not feel it now? And then the second image. A man's leathered face, lips cracked and grinning, the bulging yellow eyes glowing in triumph. Wizard, the memory told him. But that was all. And in the next instant he was sprawled, naked and bound, on the floor of Arbeely's shop. Except that it had not been only an instant. Apparently, he'd been trapped in the flask for over 1,000 years. It was Arbeely who'd managed to calculate that figure while searching for clothes for his naked guest. He'd pressed the Djinni for anything he could remember from the world of men, something that might narrow down the year of his capture. After a few false starts, the Djinni had recalled the caravan guards talking of the Grand Mosque, the new building in Asham. They'd said that inside the mosque was the head of a man, but not his body, he said. It made no sense to me. I might have misunderstood. But Arbeely assured the Djinni that he'd heard correctly. The head belonged to a man called John the Baptist, and the mosque was now known as the Umayyad Mosque, and it had stood in the city of Asham for over 1,000 years. It didn't seem possible. How could he have been trapped for that long? Rare was the djinn that lived more than 800 years, and he himself had been nearing 200 when he began to chase the caravans. But not only was he still alive, he felt no older than before. It was as though the flask that had not only contained his body, but also paused him in time. He supposed that this way a wizard could extend the usefulness of his captive for as long as possible. The flask now sat on a shelf in Arbeely's shop. Like the iron cup, it revealed nothing of its maker. Arbeely had shown him the partially erased pattern of scrollwork around its base, apparently a sort of magical stopper that had kept him sealed inside. But how did you fit in there with the olive oil? Arbeely had asked, a puzzle not nearly as interesting to the Djinni as how he'd allowed himself to be captured and bound to human form in the first place. Perhaps the wizard had followed him to the Djinn habitations, or laid some sort of trap. He wondered if the wizard had treated him like one of Suleiman's slaves, forcing him to build pleasure palaces and slaughter enemies at his command. Or had the wizard simply cast him aside, like an enticing trinket that, once acquired, loses its appeal? Of course, the man would be dead by now. The wizards of legend had been powerful indeed, but still mortal. The yellow-eyed man had long since gone to dust. And whatever enchantment he'd placed upon the Djinni, his death had not lifted it. The thought came, crawling, hideous. He might be trapped like this forever. No, he pushed the thought away. He would not accept defeat so easily. He looked down at the iron railing, then gripped it with both hands, concentrating. He was near exhaustion. The confinement in the flask had apparently destroyed his strength. But even so, within a few moments, the metal was glowing a dull red. He tightened his grip and then let go, leaving behind an outline of his fingers pressed into the railing. No, he wasn't helpless. He was still a Djinn, one of the most powerful of his kind, and there were always ways. He was beginning to shiver, but he ignored it. Instead, he turned and gazed up at the city that rose from the water's edge, the enormous square buildings that reached far into the heavens, their windows set with perfect panes of glass. As fantastical as cities like Asham and Al-Quds had seemed from the caravan men's tales, the Djinni doubted that they'd been half so wondrous or terrifying as this New York. If he must be marooned in an unknown land, surrounded by a deadly ocean and constrained to one weak and imperfect form, at least he'd ended up somewhere worth exploring. Arbeely stood a few feet away, watching the glow of the iron railing fade beneath the Djinni's hands. It still seemed impossible that this could be happening while the rest of the city went about its business, unchanged and unknowing. He wanted to grab the nearest passerby and shout, "Look at this man! He isn't a man at all! See what he's done to the railing!" He supposed that if he wanted to be hauled off to the lunatic asylum, there were worse ways to go about it. He looked out across the bay, trying to see it through the Djinni's eyes. He wondered how he himself would feel to wake up and discover that only over 1,000 years had passed. It would be enough to drive anyone mad. But the Djinni only stood straight-backed and grim, staring at the water. He didn't look like a man about to run amok. The dirty, too small clothes he wore clashed ludicrously with his figure and features, hanging from him as though in apology. He turned his back to the water and gazed at the buildings massed at the park edge. It was only then that Arbeely noticed that the Djinni was shaking from head to toe. The Djinni took a step from the railing. His knees buckled and he fell. Arbeely lunged and caught him before he hit the ground and hoisted him to his feet. "Are you ill?" "No," the Djinni muttered. "Cold." They made their way back to the shop, Arbeely half supporting, half carrying his new acquaintance. Once inside, the Djinni stumbled to the banked forge and collapsed, leaning against its scorching side. The borrowed workshirt smouldered where it touched the metal, but he didn't seem to notice. He closed his eyes. After a while, his shaking stopped, and Arbili decided he'd fallen asleep. The man sighed and looked about. There was the copper flask sitting on the shelf, but he didn't want to think about it for a moment. He needed an easy task, something quiet and calming. He found a tea kettle with a hole in the bottom, brought to him by a local restaurant owner. Perfect. He could patch a tea kettle in his sleep. He cut a patch from a sheet of tin plate, heated both kettle and patch, and set to work. Occasionally he glanced at his guest and wondered what would happen when he woke. Even silent and unmoving, the Djinni carried a strange air about him, as though he were not quite real, or else the only real thing in the room. Arbili supposed that others would sense it as well, but he doubted they'd ever guess at its meaning. The young mothers of little Syria still tied iron beads around their babies' wrists and made gestures to ward off the evil eye, but out of tradition and fond superstition more than real fear. This new world was far removed from the tales of their grandmothers, or at least so they'd thought. Not for the first time, he wished he had a confidant, someone with whom he could share even the most outrageous secret. But in the tightly knit community, Boutros Arbili was something of an outsider, even a recluse, happiest at his forge. He was terrible at idle chit-chat, and at wedding banquets could be found sitting alone at a table, examining the stamp marks on the cutlery. His neighbours greeted him warmly on the street, but never lingered long to talk. He had many acquaintances, but few close friends. It had been no different in Zala. In a family of women, he'd been the silent, dreaming boy child. He discovered smithing by lucky accident. Sent to run an errand, he'd stopped in front of the local forge and watched, fascinated, as a sweating man hammered a sheet of metal until it became a bucket. It was the transformation that enthralled him. Useless to useful, nothing to something. He returned over and over to watch until the smith, exasperated with being spied upon, offered to take on the boy as an apprentice. And so smithing came to fill Arbili's life, to the near exclusion of all else. And though he supposed in a vague way that someday he'd find a wife and start a family, he was content with things as they were. But now, gazing at his guest's prone form, he felt a premonition of lasting change. It was the same as when he'd been 7 years old and heard his mother's rising wail through the open window as she learned of her husband's death, killed by bandits on the road from Beirut. Now as then, he sensed the threads of his life scattering and rearranging before this new and overwhelming thing that had landed among them. "What is that you're doing?" Arbili jumped. The Djinni hadn't moved, but his eyes were open. Arbili wondered how long he'd been watching. "I'm patching a tea kettle," he said. "Its owner left it on the stove too long." The Djinni inclined his head towards the kettle. "And what metal is that?" "It's two metals," said Arbili. "Steel dipped in tin." He found a scrap on the table and held it out to the Djinni, pointing out the layers with his fingernail. "Tin, steel, tin. You see? The tin is too soft to use on its own, and with steel there's the problem of rust. But together like this, they're very strong and versatile." "I see. Ingenious." He sat up straighter and held out his hand to the tea kettle. "May I?" Arbili handed him the kettle, and the Djinni peered at it, turning it over in his now steady hands. "I assume the difficulty lies in thinning the edges of the patch without exposing the steel." "That's it exactly," said Arbili, surprised. The Djinni laid his hand over the patch. After a few moments, he began to carefully rub the patch around its edge. Arbili watched, dumbfounded, as the outline of the patch disappeared. The Djinni handed the tea kettle back to Arbili. It was as though the hole had never been. "I have a proposition for you," said the Djinni. Spring rains can come on suddenly in the desert. On the morning after the Djinni returned from following the caravan to the Ghouta, the skies clouded over, releasing first a thin patter of raindrops and then a respectable downpour. The dry riverbeds and gullies began to run with water. The Djinni watched the rain sluice down the walls and crenellations of his palace, irritated at the inconvenience. He had planned to depart for the Djinn habitations at first light, but now he would have to wait. And so he roamed his glass halls, examining the metalwork and making idle changes here and there to pass the time. His thoughts returned to the men of the caravan, their conversation and jests. He remembered the old man's songs about the Bedouin and wondered if the men in them had truly been so brave, the women so beautiful. Or were they only invented legends, the details altered and exaggerated over time? For 3 days, the rains came and went, 3 days of infuriating confinement. If the Djinni had been able to go outside and chase himself to the ends of the earth, then his growing obsession with the world of men might have dissipated, and he might have gone to visit the Djinn habitations of his youth, as planned. But when the clouds exhausted themselves and the Djinni at last emerged to a newly washed landscape, he found that all thoughts of returning to his own people had vanished with the rains. Chapter 3. The Golem was not even a few hours in New York before she began to long for the relative calm of the ship. The din of the streets was incredible. The noise in her head was worse. At first it nearly paralysed her, and she hid under an awning as the desperate thoughts of the pushcart vendors and paperboys rode ahead of their shouting voices. "The rent is due. My father will beat me. Please somebody buy the cabbages before they spoil." It made her want to slap her hands over her ears. If she'd had any money, she would have given it all away just to quiet the noise. Passers-by glanced her up and down, taking in her staring eyes, the dirty and dishevelled dress, the ludicrous men's coat. The women frowned. Some of the men smirked. One man, weaving drunk, grinned at her and approached, his thoughts bleary with lust. To her surprise, she realised that this was one desire she had no wish to fulfil. Repulsed, she dashed to the other side of the street. A streetcar came rattling around the corner and missed her by a hair. The conductor's curses trailed after her as she hurried away. She wandered for hours, through streets and alleys, turning corners at random. It was a humid July day and the city began to stink, a pungent mix of rotting garbage and manure. Her dress had dried, though the river silt still clung to it in flaking sheets. The woolen coat made her even more conspicuous as the rest of the city sweltered. She too was hot, but not uncomfortable. Rather, it made her feel loose-limbed and slow, as though she were wading through the river again. Everything she saw was new and unknown, and there seemed to be no end to it. She was frightened and overwhelmed, but an intense curiosity lay beneath the fear, leading her on. She peered inside a butcher's shop, trying to make sense of the plucked birds and strings of sausages, the red oblong carcasses that hung from hooks. The butcher saw her and started to come around the counter. She gave him a quick, placating smile and walked on. The thoughts of passers-by flew through her mind, but they led to no answers, only more questions. For one thing, why did everyone need money? And what exactly was money? She'd thought it merely the coins she saw exchanging hands, but it was so ubiquitous in both fear and desire that she decided there was a larger mystery to it, one she had yet to decipher. She skirted the edge of a fashionable district, and the shop windows began to fill with dresses and shoes, hats and jewellery. In front of a milliner's shop, she stopped to gaze at an enormous fantastical hat on a pedestal, its wide band bedecked with netting and fabric rosettes and a gigantic, sweeping ostrich plume. Fascinated, the golem leaned forward and put one hand on the glass, and the thin pane shattered beneath her touch. She jumped back as a rain of shards tumbled from the window and scattered onto the sidewalk. In the shop, two well-dressed women stared out at her, hands over their mouths. "I'm sorry," the golem whispered, and ran away. Afraid now, she hurried through alleys and across busy thoroughfares, trying not to blunder into pedestrians. The neighbourhoods shifted around her, changing block to block. Grubby-looking men and indignant shopkeepers shouted at one another, airing grievances in a dozen languages. Children dashed home from shoeshine stands and games of stickball, thinking eagerly of supper. A sort of mental exhaustion began to set in, dulling her thoughts. She headed eastward, following the tips of the shadows, and found herself in a neighbourhood that bustled with less chaos and more purpose. Shopkeepers were rolling up their awnings and locking their doors. Bearded men walked slowly next to each other, talking with intensity. Women stood chatting on corners, string-tied packages in their arms, children pulling at their skirts. The language they spoke was the same one she'd used with Rotfeld, the language she'd known upon waking. After the day's riot of words, hearing it again was a small, familiar comfort. She slowed now and looked around. Next to her, a tenement stoop beckoned. She'd seen men and women, young and old, sitting on such stoops all day. She tucked her skirts beneath herself and sat down. The stone was warm through her dress. She watched people's faces as they came and went. Most were tired and distracted, occupied with their own thoughts. Men began to arrive home from their shifts, exhaustion on their faces and hunger in their bellies. She saw in their minds the meals they were about to tuck into, the thick, dark bread spread with schmaltz, the herring and pickles, the mugs of thin beer. She saw their hopes for a cooling breeze, a good night's sleep. A loneliness like fatigue pulled at her. She couldn't sit on the stoop forever. She must move on. But for the moment, it felt easier to stay where she was. She rested her head against the brick of the balustrade. A pair of small brown birds was pecking in the dust at the bottom of the stoop, unconcerned by the trampling feet of passers-by. One of the birds fluttered up the steps and landed next to the golem. It prodded at the stone with its sharp beak and then turned sideways and hopped onto the golem's thigh. She was surprised, but managed to hold perfectly still as the bird perched in her lap, bobbing and pecking at the remains of the riverbed silt that still dusted her skirt. The thin, hard feet scratched at her through the fabric. Slowly, very slowly, she extended a hand. The bird hopped onto her palm and stood there, balanced. With her other hand, she stroked its back. It sat patiently as she felt its soft, sleek feathers, the tiny, fluttering heartbeat. She smiled, fascinated. It tilted its head and looked at her with a round, unblinking eye, then pecked once at her fingers, as though they were simply another patch of earth. For a moment, they regarded each other. Then it gathered itself and flew away. Startled, she turned to track its path and saw an elderly man watching her from the shadow of a grocer's cart. Like her, the man was dressed in a black wool coat despite the heat. A white fringe peeked out from underneath the hem. He wore a white beard, neatly trimmed, and his face beneath his hat was a net of deep lines. He watched her calmly, but the thought she heard was tinged with fear. Could she be what I think she is? Hurriedly, the golem stood and walked away, not looking back. Ahead of her was a crowd of men and women, passengers from the 2nd Avenue elevated. She tried to lose herself among them. Following the main part of the crowd, a small group splintered away at corners and doorways. At last she ducked into an alleyway, then dared to look out. The man in the black coat was nowhere to be seen. Relieved, she emerged from the alley and continued east. Now the air smelled of the sea again, of salt and coal smoke and engine grease. The shops were mostly closed, and the pushcart vendors were packing up their suspenders and cheap trousers, their pots and pans. What would she do once night fell? Find a place to hide, she supposed, and wait for morning. A stab of reflected hunger struck her. A scrawny, dirt-stained boy was loitering on the sidewalk ahead, eyeing a nearby vendor who stood sweating over his cart. As she watched, a man in shirt sleeves approached the vendor and gave him a coin. The vendor plucked up a sheet of waxed paper, dipped it into his cart, and emerged with a doughy disc the size of his fist. The man bit into it as he walked towards the golem, fanning the steam from his mouth. The boy's hunger rose, desperate and all-consuming. If the boy were not starving, if the man had not passed so near, if, most of all, her experiences that day had not drained her so, she might have controlled herself and walked away. But she was not so lucky. The boy's visceral plight had transfixed her. Didn't he need the meal more than the man did? No sooner had she formed this thought than her hand reached out, plucked the man's meal from his grasp, and handed it to the boy. In the next moment, he was running away down the street as fast as his legs could carry him. The man grabbed her arm. "What did you mean by that?" he snarled. "I'm sorry," she began, about to explain, but the man was red-faced and furious. "You thief!" he shouted. "You'll pay for that!" Others were beginning to notice. An older woman stepped to the man's side. "I saw the whole thing," she said, glaring at the golem. "She stole your knish and gave it to the boy. Well, girl, what do you have to say for yourself?" She looked around, bewildered. Men and women were forming a crowd around her, eager to see what would happen. "Pay up!" someone called. "I don't have any money," she said. A hard laugh ran through the crowd. They wanted her to be punished. They wanted her to pay. They were flinging their angry desires at her like stones. Panic filled her. And then, strangely, it ebbed away. She felt as though time was slowing, stretching. Colours grew sharper and more focused. The low sun seemed bright as noon. "Fetch a policeman," someone called, and the words were slurred, elongated. She closed her eyes, feeling as though she were on the edge of an abyss, teetering, about to fall. "That won't be necessary," said a voice. Instantly, the crowd's attention shifted, and the golem felt the abyss recede. Relieved, she opened her eyes. It was the old man in the black coat, the one who'd been watching her. He was coming quickly through the onlookers, concern on his face. "Will this pay for your knish?" he asked, and handed the man a coin. Then, slowly, as though not to startle her, he placed a hand on the golem's arm. "Come with me, my dear," he said. His voice was quiet but firm. Did she have a choice? It was either he or the crowd. Slowly, she stepped towards the old man, away from her accuser, who stood frowning at the coin. "But this is too much," her accuser said. "Then do something good with the rest," said the old man. The crowd began to disperse, clearly feeling they'd been robbed of entertainment. Soon it was just the two of them, together on the sidewalk. He regarded her again as he had in the cart's shadow. Then he leaned forward and seemed to sniff the air around her. "As I thought," he said, a touch regretful. "You're a golem." Shocked, she took a step back, ready to run. "No, please," he said. "You must come with me. You can't be wandering the streets like this. You'll be discovered." Should she try to lose him again? But then he had just saved her, and he seemed neither angry nor accusatory, only concerned. "Where will you take me?" she asked. "My home. It's not far from here." She didn't know if she could trust him, but he was right. She couldn't keep wandering forever. She decided she must trust him. She must trust someone. "All right," she said. They began to walk back the way she had come. "Now tell me," the old man said, "where is your master?" "He died at sea 2 days ago. We were crossing from Danzig." The man shook his head. "How unfortunate," he said. Whether he referred to Rotfeld's death or the larger situation, she wasn't certain. "Is that where you lived before this?" "No, I wasn't alive," she said. "My master didn't wake me until the crossing, just before he died." That surprised him. "You mean to say you're only 2 days old? Extraordinary." He rounded a corner and the golem followed. "And how did you make it through Ellis Island on your own?" "I was never there. An officer on the ship tried to question me because I had no ticket, so I jumped into the river instead." "That showed quick thinking on your part." "I didn't want to be discovered," she said. "Just so." They walked on, back the way the golem had come. The sun had long since ducked behind the buildings, but the sky still shone, brassy and thick with the day's heat. Children began to emerge from the tenements again, looking for one last adventure before bedtime. The man was quiet as they walked. She realized she didn't even know his name, but she hesitated to ask. He was lost in his thoughts. She could feel the questions circling in his mind, all with herself at their heart. What should I do with her? And in one brief flash, she saw an image of herself struck down, turned to a formless heap of dirt and clay in the middle of the street. She halted, stock still. But instead of panic, she only felt a deep weariness. Perhaps it would be for the best. She had no place here, no purpose. He'd noticed she was no longer at his side and doubled back, concerned. "Is something wrong?" "You know how to destroy me," she said. A pause. "Yes," he said, guarded. "I have that knowledge. Few do these days. How did you know this?" "I saw it in your mind," she said. "You considered it. For a moment, you wanted it." Confusion furrowed his brow, and then he laughed, without mirth. "Who made you?" he asked. "Was it your master?" "No," she replied. "I don't know my maker." "Whoever it was," he said, "was brilliant and reckless and quite amoral." He sighed. "You could feel others' desires." "And fears," she said, "since my master died." "Is that why you stole that knish for the boy?" "I didn't mean to steal," she said. "He was just so very hungry." "It overwhelmed you," he said, and she nodded. "We'll have to address that. Perhaps with training. Well, that can wait for now. We must deal with more practical matters first, such as finding you clothing. Then you won't destroy me. He shook his head. A man might desire something for a moment while a larger part of him rejects it. You'll need to learn to judge people by their actions, not their thoughts. A moment's hesitation. And then she said, "You're the only one to speak kindly to me since my master died. If you think it best to destroy me, I'll abide by that decision." Now he looked shocked. "Have your few days been so difficult?" "Yes, I see they must have been." He put a comforting hand on her shoulder. His eyes were dark but kind. "I'm Rabbi Avram Meir," he said. "If you'll allow it, I will take you under my protection and be your guardian. I'll give you a home and whatever guidance I can, and together we'll decide what course is best. Do you agree?" "Yes," she said, relieved. "Good." He smiled. "Now, come with me. We're almost there." Rabbi Meir's building was a tenement like all the others, its hard facade stained with dirt and smoke. The lobby was dark and close, but well kept. The stairs creaked with protest beneath their feet. The golem noticed that her companion's breathing grew laboured as they ascended. The rabbi's rooms were on the 4th floor. A narrow entryway led to a cramped kitchen with a deep sink, a stove and an icebox. Socks and underclothes hung above the sink, drying. More laundry sat in piles on the floor. Dirty dishes lay jumbled together on top of the stove. "I wasn't expecting company," said the rabbi, embarrassed. The bedroom was large enough only for its bed and a wardrobe. Beyond the kitchen was a small parlour with a deep, worn sofa of green velvet set beneath a large window. Next to it was a small wooden table with 2 chairs. A large collection of books lined one side of the room, their spines cracked and faded. More books were stacked in haphazard piles about the room. The rabbi said, "I don't have much, but it's enough. Consider this your home for the time being." The golem stood in the middle of the parlour, not wishing to dirty his sofa with her dress. "Thank you," she said. And then she caught sight of the window. The sky was darkening and the gas lamps in the parlour were bright enough to create a reflection. She saw the image of a woman superimposed against the neighbouring building. One hand fluttered up slightly from her side, then lowered. The woman in the window did the same. She stepped closer, fascinated. "Ah," said the rabbi quietly, "you haven't seen yourself yet." She studied her own face, then ran a hand through her hair, felt the thin strands stiff with river water. She gave it an experimental tug. Would it grow or remain forever the same length? She ran her tongue over her teeth, then held out her nails. Her hand. Her nails were short and square. The nail on her left index finger had been set a bit off-centre. She wondered if anyone beside herself would ever notice. The rabbi watched her examine herself. "Your creator was quite gifted," he said. But he couldn't keep a hint of disapproval from his tone. She looked back down to her fingertips. Nails, teeth, hair. None of these features were made of clay. "I hope," she said, watching her own mouth move, "that no one was harmed in my making." The rabbi smiled sadly. "So do I. But what's done is done, and you are not to be blamed for your own creation, whatever the circumstances. Now I must go find you some clean clothes. Stay here, please. I'll be back shortly." Alone, she watched her reflection for a little while longer, thinking, what if the rabbi had not come when he had? What would have happened? She'd been standing inside the angry crowd's circle, feeling the world fall away, as though she were about to cross a threshold into... what? She didn't know. But in that moment, she'd felt calm, peaceful, as though all worries and decisions were about to be lifted from her shoulders. Remembering, she shivered with a fear she didn't understand. It was growing late and most of the shops were closed, but the rabbi knew that a few would still be open near the Bowery, willing to sell him a woman's dressing gown and a few pairs of underclothes. He could barely afford the expense. Besides his small pension from his former congregation, his only income came from teaching Hebrew to young boys studying to become bar mitzvot. But it must be done. Warily he crossed the raucous thoroughfare, avoiding the paths of drunken men and the eyes of the women who stood beneath the elevated, waiting for custom. On Mulberry he found a clothing store still open and bought a woman's shirtwaist and skirt, a dressing gown, slips and drawers, and stockings with garters. After a moment's hesitation, he added a nightgown to the pile. She wouldn't need it for sleeping, of course, but the selection of women's things had overwhelmed him. And besides, she couldn't simply wear a dressing gown with nothing on beneath it. The clerk frowned at his coat and fringe, but took his money quickly enough. He carried the string-wrapped package back across the Bowery, thinking. It would be difficult, living with someone who sensed one's desires. If he wasn't careful, he'd fall to chasing his own mind, trapped in the maddening game of don't think about that. He'd have to be completely honest and unabashed and hide nothing. It wouldn't come easy, but any misplaced courtesy would do her a disservice. The larger world would not be so accommodating. There would be consequences to his actions, to his sheltering of her. He had known this from the moment he'd recognized her nature and decided not to destroy her. Childless, retired, a widower for close to 10 years, Rabbi Avram Meir had planned for himself a quiet old age and an uneventful death. But the Almighty, it seemed, had planned otherwise. It. Yay!
You found a nice man.
She found a nice man.
The only nice man ever.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, our first nice man in Storytime. Although he is also played by our first ever nice man in Storytime, which was, who was it in Chocolat? Was it Guillaume? Was it Guillaume who was the nice man with the dog?
Yep.
Yeah. I think he's playing Rabbi Avram Meir.
I think the philosopher in 1,000 Nights is also involved.
Yes. Yes.
And by the end of the night circus, Bailey was a man, and Bailey was lovely.
Yeah, the only good people are very old men or young boys.
The small hairy man in Stardust was nice.
He was nice. So you're enjoying it?
Yes.
Excellent. I am very relieved. I'm glad.
I think I'm extra geeking out hard because I'm fairly certain that my great-grandmother came to North America on the Ellis Island boats.
That's cool. That's
Is she a golem?
Not to my knowledge, but I did never meet her, so.
Where is she from, Simon?
She was coming from Russia on that side, I believe.
I've just seen Djinni and Tonic. Is that Mike? Is that you?
Yes, who else?
Of course it is. I love you so much. For the catch-up crew, who I think you probably can't see Mike at the moment, Mike's new name is Djinni and Tonic. I approve. Also, I could just fancy a gin and tonic now.
I was just thinking that.
Gin and tonic. I might have a little drink, you know.
What?
I might.
You?
I know. I know. Would you be interested in a drink at all? We can make. We're gonna have a drink.
It could be magical.
Could be magical. Very
Gin and
exciting. Oh, we made pasta for dinner tonight. We made like stuffed, like homemade ravioli for dinner tonight. Very fucking nice.
That's impressive.
Very, very enjoyable and nice. Delicious.
You put inside.
How hard is it to make the shells? Because I was going to make pumpkin puree today to use in pasta tomorrow and was just going to make a sauce, but putting pumpkin puree in ravioli with like some cinnamon just sounds really lovely.
Not very difficult. So ours was so I usually use 100 grams of flour for one egg, but that's for a large egg. So I for the two of us did like 200 grams and 2 eggs, and they were quite small eggs, so it was quite a stiff dough, which meant that we had difficulty rolling it out super thin. So they ended up being quite like thick, like thicker than is ideal for pasta. So it's not difficult at all, but if your eggs are quite small, probably a bit less than 100 grams of flour per egg would be what I would say.
Did you just roll it out with a rolling pin, or do you have a pasta roller?
I've got a pasta machine at home, but we just did it with a rolling pin here, and it was like, yeah, piece of piss. Would have been much easier if it wasn't such a like stiff dough. So yeah,
Sounds lovely, thank you. Maybe I will.
If you do it, will you send us a picture?
Of course.
Amazing. Oh, we should say goodbye to the catch-up crew. Goodbye again. Catch-up crew, we love you. We love you. Goodbye.